gentlemen, harnessing the art of science of umami to make superlative cuisine. We welcome back on stage Chris Kotke, Corporate Executive Chef, Ajinomoto. Young man,
Thank you, sir.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
Come on. Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you. So I'm here today to talk about umami. And you may be thinking, I know what umami is. Everyone talks about umami. You know, it's one of the very powerful words. We use it in our cooking today. I've been talking to a lot of chefs about umami over the years, and one thing I've learned is that we don't always really totally understand it. How many times I've received a text from somebody, oh, I had these slow-cooked onions. Oh, the umami. Bummer, there's no umami there. Oh, that charred steak. Oh, the char. Umami. No, that's not umami. So chefs, do we really know what umami is? Let's find out. Let's look at the science of it. But before we go there, I want to tell you a story. It's the journey of umami. I'm old enough to remember when umami wasn't a thing. No one talked about it. I remember when it first started to show up and people started to talk about it. It's like this Asian wisdom. Is it really a taste? So we begin our journey actually in Germany. In the 1850s, scientists in Germany discovered a little amino acid. It was called glutamate. Very important to our journey today. From there, we travel to France, actually. And Frederic, thank you for the introduction to this wonderful book, La Physiologie du Goût by Brillat-Savarin, because in that book from the 1826, there's a little tiny 2-page chapter called Osmosome. And when I read Osmosome 30 years ago and I lived in France, I'm like, what is he talking about? And when I started to understand what umami was, Brillat-Savarin had figured out there was something there that he couldn't explain, that there wasn't a word in the French language to explain what it was, and he made up a word called osmosome, but it didn't stick. Had it stuck, today we would, instead of we'd say our fifth taste is umami, we would say it's osmosome. But we'll leave the umami word to Dr. Ikeda, 1907, chemist at the University of Tokyo. He figures out what it is through some pretty interesting science where he just tasted stuff. And he figured out that it's this little amino acid called glutamate. And he is the one then that invented the word umami. The reason we call it umami is because of Dr. Ikeda, 1907, 1908. But all this time, there's still debate. Is it actually a basic taste? Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami? 2002, United States, University of Miami. It is definitively discovered what are the taste receptors in your mouth for umami and the pathway to your brain. That's how you know something is a basic taste. Done. So that's put to bed forever. So umami, basic taste. And you say, well, wow, so we now discover umami, but guess what? Umami's been around a long time. The Italians, the Romans knew what it was. They called it garum. Modern fish sauces today in Thailand, it's all about umami. We're going to talk about that. But that's a little journey. And in fact, you see, if umami isn't an Asian thing, but is a human thing, every one of us has receptors on our tongue and in our mouth that register umami. Every one of us. Even if we don't know what it is. Because guess what? How do you know that when you eat something sweet, it's called sweet? Or whatever your language is. How do you know that? Because at some point when you were very little, you tasted something sweet, you got that really happy face, and someone said in your language, oh, isn't that sweet? And you went, that pleasurable sensation is what's called sweet. When you were young, Which of your parents said, "Oh, honey, isn't that umami?" And the problem is, we don't know in our brain what we are sensing on our palate. And by the way, umami and sugar are the two intrinsically liked tastes for all human beings. And that's been proven. So we see examples of umami all over the world. It's a desirable taste globally. Okay, what is it? Let's jump into science. So, bear with me, because if we don't understand the science, we don't understand umami. What is it? A protein, right? Proteins are made up of things called amino acids. There are 20 amino acids. A protein looks kind of like what you see up there. Not really. It's like a train with train cars, and each train car is an amino acid, and it's all wrapped up in a ball, kind of. If there's any food scientists out here, I apologize for that explanation. In those amino acids, you have some that are called glutamate, as you can see by the red dots up there. Hang on to this, because this is a really important thing. Did you know that when amino acids are on their own, please understand what I just said, on their own, they're not attached to anything else, no protein, no peptide, on their own, they have taste. Only two of them taste like umami. Glutamate is the big one. And then, of course, you have I won't move. You have a subset that tastes sweet. By the way, that's where all artificial sweeteners come from. And you have a big subset that tastes bitter. If you forget everything else today, remember this slide. This is where the rubber meets the road. Umami, well, let's begin with something called a free glutamic acid. Remember that slide 2 slides ago with the little train and the 3 red dots? When glutamate, that amino acid, is on its own, it's called a free glutamic acid. That is the thing, when it bumps into your taste receptors for umami, that fires the message off to your brain, and your brain goes, "Oh gosh, that's good." Umami is the sensation when that one amino acid bumps into your taste buds. It has to be on its own, though. That's a critical thing. And this thing at the bottom there, see, ribonucleotide, just hang on to that, because that's going to blow our minds. By the way, chefs, you know all this already. You may not know it scientifically, but you cook like this, and I'll show you examples. But if you look at let's look at those foods on both sides of this slide. Pay attention to the one Parmesan cheese as an example. You'll see in Parmesan cheese, there's a lot of glutamate in there. You see that number? What is it? 8,210 milligrams. Okay. That doesn't matter, because that's in a protein, and you can't taste it. But notice what's underneath, parentheses, 1,600 free glutamic acid. That's the stuff that bumps into your taste buds. That's the stuff that fires a message off to your brain. And oh, by the way, when that server comes to your table with the Parmesan cheese in an Italian restaurant and says, "Would you like some Parmesan cheese on top of your pasta?" Actually, what they're saying to you is, "Would you like some umami on top of your pasta?" Because Parmesan is an umami bomb. Huge amounts of free glutamic acid. Why? So, this is how it works. By the way, take a look on the right side of the slide. Interestingly enough, you have taste receptors in your mouth that send the message off to your brain. What is umami? We know that. The really interesting research today is you also have receptors in your gut. And there's some really compelling evidence that umami is one of the things that actually signals to your brain when to stop eating. It gives messages of satiety, of being full. What does umami do? Umami does some pretty neat stuff. Number one, chefs, when a food is rich in umami, the taste of the food lasts longer in your mouth. Of all 5 of your basic tastes, the one that hangs out the longest and the most prevalently, the highest amount is umami. Salt goes away pretty fast. Acid goes away pretty fast. Sweet hangs on a little bit but goes away, and umami sticks around for a long time. Which of us doesn't want food that tastes great and you just keep tasting it? That's one of the beauties of umami. It also makes you salivate like crazy. One of the hallmarks of something that's rich in umami, when you're done eating it, you'll find like lots of saliva in your mouth. Now you may go, who cares? In the aging population, there's a thing called dry mouth, and that is as people get older, they don't produce enough saliva in their mouth, and you have to have saliva to taste food. So this is actually a really big thing for the aging taste palate. Okay. Go back to Parmesan for a minute. How do you create free glutamic acid in food? Remember, go back to a protein. A protein is a train. Protein is a train. Each train car is an amino acid, and it's kind of all bound up in a ball. When I do things like whipped cream, whip egg whites, whatever, I'm what's called denaturing a protein. I'm unraveling it. I'm changing the shape. That's not how we create umami. The way you create umami is you actually have to break the protein apart. That's hard to do. Proteins don't like to be broken apart. But there are some really interesting mechanisms to do that. The most powerful, and geez, I'm so sorry I'm moving. If you look through the center there, it's ripening. Like a riper tomato has much more umami than an unripe tomato. Why does it taste better? Curing, drying, think hams. Think dried cured beef or aged beef. Why does it taste better? Because we're creating umami. How does that happen? Because in the meat, including cheese, by the way, there are enzymes. Enzymes are really effective at breaking apart proteins. They're like scissors. They just go to a protein and go snip, 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 snip. And in doing so, it creates the free glutamic acid. You follow me on this? Couple nods to be sure. Uh-oh, most of you are nodding. The deal is, if we break up the protein and we create free glutamic acid, we have umami. As a cheese ages, why do old cheeses taste better? Because they have more time to interact with the enzymes. And the enzymes, the scissors, cut more proteins up, and we get more umami over time as a cheese ages, as a ham ages. Today, go and taste the dried lamb legs, the cured lamb legs in the trade show. He has one that's quite a bit older. Guess what? Tons more umami. That's why. And oh, by the way, when we cook things for long periods of time, like stock, we also get more umami. Now, that's kind of neat, but it gets more interesting. You see, there's a subset of ingredients out there that are called ribonucleotides. This is getting really chemically sounding. It's going to make sense to the next slide. There's this group of things, ribonucleotides, that when you have foods that are rich in those, combined with foods that have lots of free glutamic acid, something amazing happens in your palate. And it's not a 1 + 1 = 2 equation. It's 1 + 1 = 8, 10, 15. And you get a taste explosion in your mouth. The reason it works is because those ribonucleotides, when the glutamic acid engages with your taste receptors, it keeps your taste receptors open longer, and so it keeps firing the message off to your brain. It's good, it's good, it's good. It's not being washed away. You follow me? So what are those ribonucleotides? There they are. By the way, every living creature on the face of the earth produces glutamate in their bodies. Every one, including you and me. In fact, glutamate is the #1 amino acid in our human bodies. It's a really important thing, actually. Okay, take a look at this. All living things have some glutamate in them. But some things have really high levels, like, for instance, kombu, seaweed. And then you look on the right side of your slide and you'll see the nucleotides. They're grouped in two things. They're called inosinates, they're animal sources, and guanolates, those are vegetable sources, typically mushrooms. And if you take a look at dried fish, like bonito, or katsubushi. If I combine kombu and katsubushi, what did I just make? Japanese food, what did I just make? I made the base stock of Japanese food called dashi. Why does dashi work? I grew up in France and, French food, and we have to have all these ingredients and simmer it for 12 hours. And then I go to Japan, and they're like, let's make dashi. It takes about 45 minutes. There's 2 ingredients, and you're like, how can that be good? This is why. Because I have an ingredient that's high in glutamic acid, high in inosinate, I combine them, and kaboom, it's the atomic bomb of flavor in your mouth. It also explains why mirepoix works with meat. It also explains why a cheeseburger tastes better than a hamburger, and on and on and on. There's many examples throughout the world of this, and chefs, we know this intrinsically. Okay, elephant in the room. Go back to Dr. Ikeda. Dr. Ikeda, remember he discovered umami. He figured out what umami was. He figured out it's glutamate, that one amino acid. But there's a problem with glutamate. When you taste it on its own, it's a white crystal, looks like salt. It's really acidic. L-glutamic acid, it's called, is really acidic. And he figured out if you can buffer the acidity with a sodium, boom, put those together, it brings it to neutral. What did he invent? He invented MSG. MSG took the world by storm. Really interesting thing. And this is where I want to spend a little time on this slide, because I talk to a lot of chefs who are like, oh, I will never cook with MSG. And I say, why? Oh, I will only cook with natural umami. Really? Funny thing, the glutamate in MSG is exactly the same as the glutamate in Parmesan. There is chemically no difference. None. And in fact, it makes sense, because glutamate is our number 1 amino acid in our bodies. But we're going to get to that in a little bit. The point here is, your body does not recognize any difference whether you eat it glutamate in Parmesan or an aged sausage, or if you get it in MSG. No difference whatsoever. It's exactly the same thing. How do I think about this as a chef? Now follow me on this for a minute. There's 2 ways of getting umami into your food. The first is you choose an ingredient that is high in umami. Okay, miso, soy sauce, Worcestershire sauce, ketchup, fish sauce from Southeast Asia, aged cheeses, aged meats, kimchi if it has little fish in it. Okay. That's great. I can put that in my food, and sometimes that's what you want. If I'm making Thai food, I'm going to put in fish sauce because I need the taste of that. But if I'm making beef bourguignon, I'm not going to add fish sauce because it doesn't taste right. So strategy 1 is umami plus other flavors. And that works sometimes for what we're doing. Strategy 2 is to use MSG, and MSG is umami with no other flavor. Follow me on this. And this is where I've talked to a lot of chefs. They'll say, well, that's fine, but I don't want to use it. I said, okay, if we follow that train of thought, chefs, I'm going to take salt out of your kitchen also. Okay? And all you can use is salty ingredients. They'd be like, well, wait. Wait. What is salt? Salt is pure salinity. Is that cheating? Umami, or MSG, is pure umami. Is that cheating? We're adding one of our basic tastes. So there's 2 ways to do it. When I put MSG in food, why? It's because I want to bump up the umami a little bit. You know what kills me is in culinary schools today, what do we always tell students? Is there enough salt in there? Is there enough salt in there? How about enough salt? When was the last time you heard a chef say to a culinary student, what's the umami level? Is there enough umami in there? And yet, we know it is one of the most important of our 5 basic tastes to food that tastes great. We have to rethink this, armed with the science of what it is. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, but I don't know about MSG. I've heard so much that it's unsafe. How did that happen? It started in 1968. In 1968, there was one letter to a scientific or a medical journal in the United States. And the guy wrote in, by the way, this would never be published today. No scientific study, no scientific data. He just said, you know, when I eat in Chinese restaurants, I get headaches. Could be MSG, could be the cooking wine, could be the high levels of salt. Now, at that time in the United States, there was a real backlash against China. And so what happened is they called that article the Chinese restaurant syndrome. And from that day forward, and some really bad science experiments in the years that followed, a few years after that, people started to believe that it was bad. And yet, the science will tell you otherwise. Every scientific organization globally, every regulatory organization globally has come back and basically said there's no problem. In fact, 2 years ago, the National Institutes for Headaches took it off of their list of headache triggers because they're like, there's no science to back this up. It is the most studied food ingredient out there, and yet every time it comes back is completely safe, and yet the myth that this is somehow bad for you prevails. And yet, remember, the glutamate in the MSG is the same as in the Parmesan. By the way, it's great for reducing sodium. Try this, chefs. I know there's a lot of attention about sodium today. Instead of putting in, let's call it, 1 teaspoon of salt, put in 2/3 of a teaspoon of salt and 1/3 of a teaspoon of MSG. It's crazy. The food tastes better. Why? Because we're exciting 2 different taste receptors in our mouth, not just one. Oh, by the way, if you do that, you reduce sodium by 25%. And the reason is really simple. There's far less sodium in MSG than in salt. Try it. I leave you with this last slide. And this is where, I loved what Frederic just said before us. As chefs, we have to always be growing. I used to fervently believe that MSG was bad until I looked into the science. And I was like, wow, this is all completely wrong. The reality is, umami is one of our basic tastes. The reality is, it's something we as a human species desire. We also know as chefs, it is most likely certainly one of the most important basic tastes. It's described as the bass note. In music, you got the bass guy who's always boom, 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 boom. No one ever pays attention to that person. Boom, 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 boom. But if you take the person out of the music, it falls flat. Umami is the bass note that you build the rest of flavors on top of. And it's powerful. It deepens the flavor in your food. And again, MSG is to umami as salt is to salinity. So try it. Stretch yourselves. Thank you.